ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Melissa Lane to the stage.
In modern societies, we usually think of writing laws down on paper or in electronic form so that they can be ready to hand and widely circulated. But in ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean societies, writing laws originally meant writing them up. So they would be engraved in giant public inscriptions on stone or wood, fixed in place for passersby to see, rather than available for circulation from hand to hand. Now, this is actually an engraved Italian law from the late 18th century, but it shows the survival of that ancient mode of publishing laws. And we can see it here in antiquity, not very well, but this is an image of the Gorton Code from Crete from about the 5th century before the Common Era. And I'm going to come back to the Gorton Code. This is the most extensive code that we have of ancient Greek laws. So that contrast between writing laws down and writing them up, I hope will help us to open our minds to many different kinds of ways in which writing laws has functioned, both in ancient societies and also today. And we'll find that there are some very different ways and also some surprisingly similar ones. Now, if we just think of ancient societies themselves, we can see that they also had some striking commonalities in their legal content. So, for example, what the Romans have come to know, have brought us to come to know as the lex talionis, an eye for an eye. And this is the principle more broadly that a punishment should precisely fit a given crime. So as you can see, we find this in ancient Babylon, and we'll come back to the Code of Hammurabi later on. We find it in the Hebrew Bible, and we find it in the 12 tables of ancient Rome, to which the statesman and philosopher Cicero here was referring. But even though we have these common contents in many cases, and we find in all of these societies ancient laws about trade, about debts, about theft, about marriage and divorce, but we also will find many divergences in how laws functioned. For example, the difference between laws written up in a kingdom and laws written up in a democracy. And so to try to make sense of these commonalities and these divergences, what I'm going to propose as a perspective is that we consider writing as a tool for law. So here you can see all the different tools that have been used, stylized here as a stylus, a quill pen, and we'll come in a moment to the final image. So this perspective suggests that law does not require or depend upon being put in writing. But once we do start to write laws, that can shape the nature of the laws themselves. And we're familiar with this, that the kind of tool that we have available can make a real and important difference to the work that we do with it. So think of the difference between using a stylus and using a modern pen. So to develop this perspective, we can think of writing and law on the model of blueprints and buildings. So blueprints are not necessary to conceive or build a structure. And indeed, in ancient Greece, many buildings were constructed through verbal plans, sketches, or the collective know-how of a crew of builders. And we can imagine that with the slightly wonky-looking house on the left. But once the use of a blueprint becomes standard, as a tool, it transforms the whole process. It transforms what it's possible to build and how it's possible to think about building. And in particular, I want to highlight two features of blueprints that are also characteristic of written laws. So the first is uniformity, Blueprints enable builders to replicate designs and ensure uniformity across different projects. And writing, similarly, enables laws to be applied consistently. Indeed, anthropologists have suggested that writing fosters the very habit of thinking in general categories, and they call this legalism, the habit of putting things into legalistic boxes. So that's the first characteristic of written law, uniformity. And the second is inflexibility. So we can see this again with blueprints. Blueprints can constrain innovation. So too, written laws are rigid inherently. They're resistant to change. They're difficult to apply precisely to every given situation. And as you can also see, this inflexibility can also be related to a kind of elitism in both cases. Once something is fixed, someone needs the tools to decipher it. So in the case of blueprints, you need the training of an architect to be able to measure just so. And in the case of written laws, you need professional scribes to write them up and also to read them. In fact, some ancient societies have been described as cases of scribal literacy, where the main people who were literate were the scribes who were able to do the writing and also do the reading. So I want you to keep these two characteristics in mind, uniformity and inflexibility, and we're going to see that they keep coming up. So what I now want to do is to survey the origin of writing and written laws in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, which is my focus for tonight. And then we'll turn to examine three different functions that the writing of laws in these societies could serve. But first I want to introduce you to how it is that we came to have written laws at all. So language is, of course, far older than writing. We can't date the earliest love song, the earliest lullaby. But writing clearly had a beginning. We can actually date at least the writing that survived. And we can identify, for example, the Phoenicians with having developed the first written alphabet, even though, as the scholar Harvey Eunice has observed, writing has since established itself over time and across much of the world. And so the first point we have to appreciate is that the uses of writing are actually far older than its use for writing laws. So according to the British Museum, cuneiform, depicted here, is, as far as we know, the oldest form of writing in the world. It originated before 3200 BC. And notice the reference to scribes there, right? That role of scribes that I said was characteristic of writing. It was originating as a bookkeeping tool for very mundane purposes, right? Tracking these everyday economic interactions, keeping track of bread and beer rations. So you can see that writing itself goes with rudimentary bureaucracies, limited and variable literacy, those who were able to make use of it. But it's not until about 1,000 years later that we actually find our first evidence of writing being used for laws. So the oldest inscribed laws that we know of are the Code of Ur-Nammu, written in cuneiform, recording the Sumerian language around 2000 BCE. Scholars think that these laws were probably authored by not Ur-Nammu himself, who was a Sumerian king, but by his son and successor. And this law code, as we think of it, has an inscription that set the model for centuries to come of ancient Near Eastern laws. So first there's a prologue, then a list of logs, and then an epilogue. And both the prologue and the epilogue refer to the intentions of the person who promulgated the laws. So as we'll emphasize, actually the lawgiver's aims, their capacities, are more important than the specific laws that are included. Now, another really interesting feature, of the these laws is their universal formulation. So one scholar comments that Sumerian laws were always formulated in terms that applied to everyone and were also conditional. So a law would be, if a man allows his fields to flood, then he owes this much compensation to his neighbors. So here we see that idea of uniformity. And this is actually pushing uniformity to its farthest extent because it's claimed to be actual universality. Now, not all laws go that far. So, for example, the Code of Hammurabi and other Akkadian laws often regiment their application. They specify particular groups of people with particular social statuses. So there we see uniformity, but only in particular groups, right? But we see whether it's just uniform or uniform to the extent of being universal, we see this tendency to treat people and events and things in categories, that aspiration to uniformity that's part of its blueprint-like potential that I introduced earlier. Now, in contrast to Near Eastern cuneiform, after the Dark Ages, the Greeks came to adopt alphabetic writing, and they adopted it around 750 BCE, so this cup is one of the earliest surviving examples of inscribed alphabetic Greek writing. And as I said, they borrowed their alphabet, they adapted it from Phoenician. But once again, we see that the earliest uses of Greek alphabetic writing, just like the earliest uses of cuneiform, were not for laws. So here we find it as an inscription on a cup. We actually even find graffiti on cups and bowls among the earliest surviving Greek alphabetic writings. We find epitaphs, dedications, and so on. But remember that the gap between Near Eastern cuneiform and its inscribed laws was about 1,000 years, but the gap between Greek alphabetic writing and its earliest inscribed laws was only about 100 years. So that's a very striking difference. So we can see here, again, as you just noted, the earliest Greek alphabetic writing is from about 750. Only a century later, we find the earliest surviving Greek legal inscription, which was actually from Dreros on Crete. So similarly on Crete, and we'll come to the content of that inscription later on. Solon, about 50 years later, wrote his laws for Athens, and beyond the dates on the slide, the Romans would send a delegation to Athens to study Solon's laws in shaping their own 12 tables, which were believed to have been written down around 450. So one question we can ask when we look at these dates is, does this mean that no statutory laws at all existed before whatever date they were first recorded in writing? Now, one Greek historian has claimed this, and he begins by pointing out, and I think he's right about this, that there's far more to a legal system than statutes alone. So he talks about what we find depicted on the shield of Achilles. This is described for us in Homer's Iliad. And part of this shield are leaders who act as judges giving oral verdicts. So what we can see is that actually oral procedures of justice can be far older than written laws. And this is generally the case in antiquity. And of course, we might also think about the English common law, where what we can call law develops through particular judicial decisions. It doesn't have to be guided or determined by general statutes. So I think these points are important, but this historian, Michael Gagarin, I think goes too far in this claim when he has contended that writing created law for the Greeks, although he specifies law in the sense of statutes. To my mind, these earliest written Greek laws seem to have been so piecemeal that it's hard to think of them as holding this special elevated status that now, for the first time, we have statutes, whereas just a moment before someone wrote them up, we didn't have that at all. I think it's hard to see the already existing and evolving procedures, institutions, and office holders suddenly functioning in a radically different way with the inscribing of laws than they did before. So to my mind, this way of putting it, isolating statutes as the only proper laws, is more a modern sensibility than an ancient one. Now, actually, anthropologists of law can help us further here because they direct us to think more broadly about laws as rules. And they can be rules of many different kinds. They can encompass conflict regulation and institutional formation. They can be more or less general, more or less explicit. So when we formulate them in writing, we will tend to make them, as we saw, more uniform and more inflexible. But that's only a tool, right? It changes the way that they work, but it doesn't necessarily change their fundamental nature. Writing isn't essential for law, even if it makes a difference once we start to use it. And indeed, it's important to remember that in antiquity, and indeed even today, even once we start to use writing for laws, it's always intertwined with continued oral practices. So on the right, you can see that even the way laws were described in ancient Greece was quite varied. Some communities, like this Cretan city of Gortys, called their laws the writings, ta grammata. That's how they refer in the inscription itself to what it's doing. But in Sparta, a number of crucial laws that were issued by the lawgiver Lycurgus were each referred to as he rhetra, the spoken thing. So we can see that the idea that laws were written was far from uniform across ancient Greece. And similarly, even when laws were written, they still had to be given human voice. And we see this again in a 20th century imagination of Solon pronouncing his laws. But that's not pure fiction, because even once Solon's laws had been written up in Athens, in court cases, somebody would be called on to read them out, right? So just because something's been inscribed doesn't mean it doesn't also have to be recited. And we see the same thing, interestingly, in medieval Iceland, where there was historically a law speaker who was charged with reciting the unwritten laws. But even after the laws were collected and written down, the law speaker still continued to have a role. So that question of how to give the laws voice is going to occupy me in my lecture in February. But let me now give you the outline for the remainder of our time tonight. So what I want to do now is to look at three specific ways that writing, and especially writing laws, came to function in the Near East and Mediterranean in antiquity. So first, to convey an impression of power and justice. Secondly, to control power. And thirdly, as a special case of controlling power, to democratize power. And I hope that these functions also will help us to think about how laws might function today. Now, that said, this first way of thinking about laws, conveying an impression, is actually quite different from the way that we might first start to think of laws working. Because we think of laws actually being read, being studied, being applied by police officers, by bureaucrats. And that, of course, depends on pretty widespread literacy. We think of the text of the laws as being what really matters. But let's look at how the Gorton Code, remember that code that we saw kind of in shadow, that's the most extensive body of laws that were inscribed in ancient Greece. Let's look at how they operated. So our habit, again, would be to think of what they say, to think of their content as a text. But the historian James Whitley has suggested that we should see the Gorton Code in exactly the opposite way. As he writes, we should see it first and foremost as a monument and not as a text. And in his view, as a monument, it was there to represent the majesty of the law to a largely illiterate population. So this is why I began with laws being written up. Because if you think about laws being carved into stone in these giant letters, what was most impressive about that was the effort to carve them into stone. It was like seeing a huge statue or a magnificent building. It was there to impress more than it was there, in this case, we can argue, to be read. And we can see this in even more detail in the case of the Code of Hammurabi. So you see on the left the stela that has the greatest surviving extent of the Code of Hammurabi. That's in the Louvre. And scholars have argued that this too should be read, not so much for the content, the textual detail of the laws, but rather as a monument to Hammurabi himself, to his power and his justice. Now, like the Sumerian and Akkadian laws that we talked about before, we see here a prologue, a set of laws, and an epilogue. But the function of the laws, although they cover lots of everyday situations, commerce, marriage, and so on, the function is very puzzling. Because we have a lot of other Babylonian legal documents, but they almost never refer to any of Hammurabi's specific laws. So it doesn't seem that these laws were really functioning as a code. They weren't comprehensive, and they don't seem to be cited in actual judicial decisions. They don't seem to have played a role in guiding executive or judicial decisions in any very specific way. So how can we make sense of that? Well, the scholar Mark van de Meerup has suggested that the key lies in this line, which follows the inscription of the laws on the stone, and it refers to the laws not as laws, but as just verdicts, which Hammurabi, the able king, has established. So in other words, they're not laws in the sense that they're looking forward, prescribing what should be done in the future. They're rather evidence. They're a sign, a monument, if you will, to Hammurabi's dedication to justice as king. So they're not a textual input to his decisions, but it's more a record of his output that's meant to impress his subjects and give them confidence that Hammurabi's reign as king will continue to be just. So the point of Hammurabi's code is to exhibit the justice that he dispenses, not to regiment his decisions or the decisions of others according to specific texts. And again, we can relate this to broader categories in the anthropology of law. As one legal anthropologist, Fernanda Piri, has written, legal rules and categories, at their most basic, are a public expression of moral order. And this is what we can see Hammurabi's laws as having been. They express the kind of justice to which he's aspiring as king, rather than sort of regimenting and dictating the way that people should act in a legal setting. So this is certainly one way that laws can function, this monumentality that impresses us rather than, as it were, instructs us. But in other contexts, historians have sometimes taken a very different view, because we can sometimes read the fact of a law being made and being written not as a sign that all is well, which is the way that the Hammurabi Code was working, but as a sign that there's a problem of moral order that needs to be fixed. So that's a very different way that laws might function. And this leads me to the next function that I want to consider, which is laws that function to control power. So this is where laws are actually doing something to fix problems, not just displaying the justice that already exists. And this is, I think, the right perspective to consider the earliest written law surviving from ancient Greece. This is that law from Dreros from the mid-7th century BCE. And this is the entire text of the law. I know it's in a little bit small print, so I'm going to read out the crucial bits. It's about an already existing office, the highest office in the city, which is an office called cosmos, which literally means order. So this is the office holder, the public official, who's charged with maintaining social order. And this is about term limits and rotation in office. So the law says, after someone has served as cosmos, the same individual shall not be cosmos again for 10 years. And if they do try to take up the office too soon, they'll be fined, they'll be deprived of civic rights, and whatever they do in that second term would be nullified. So this is meant to really insist that people have to allow this 10-year waiting period between possible terms of office. Now, why is this? Well, the editors of this inscription have explained that the point of this was that once someone has been in public office, when they were in that office, they were immune to lawsuits for their conduct. But once they finished the office, then lawsuits could be brought against them if they had behaved badly in office. And the 10 years is meant to allow time for those lawsuits to be raised and resolved before anyone could be allowed to hold office again. So making people wait a decent interval was a way of ensuring that they not be eligible for office before the lawsuits had been resolved. And so what is the point of that? Well, as they suggest, the point is to prevent a single individual through repeated re-election from accumulating excessive authority in the city. And this law seems to have worked better than some modern constitutions in preventing people from taking up high office through re-election before lawsuits from their previous term had been resolved. Now, that all might sound to us like a proto-democratic idea. If you read that idea, preventing individuals from accumulating excessive authority, you might think, here we're on the road to democracy. But it's important to say that at least this city at this time was not a democracy. It was still an oligarchy or an aristocracy. So this is people who had concern with controlling power, but often in terms of controlling intra-elite conflict, sometimes by enrolling the populace on the side of one group of factional elite against another. And so again, many of the very earliest Greek laws that we find written seem to have been playing this kind of role. So for example, on Chios in the early 6th century, again an oligarchy at the time, we find written laws that were serving to, again, regulate office holders, in part by giving certain powers to a council of the people. And the historian John Ma has said we should see this as evidence of a network of institutionalization. So again, as I suggested, we shouldn't isolate and elevate the laws by themselves. The point is really how they fit into this ongoing evolution of legal and political functioning, all these different institutions and powers. So what we've seen is written laws are not necessarily democratic, right? We saw that they could be used by kings like Urnamu and his son and Hammurabi. They could be used by aristocrats, as in Dreros or Chios. But what about the opposite connection? Written laws are not necessarily democratic, but do democracies need written laws, or can democracies flourish without them? So this is the final main section of my lecture that I want to discuss. So the historian Paul Woodruff, reflecting on ancient Greece, has suggested that democracies do need written laws. And so the ultimate way of controlling power, our second theme, has to be democratic control of power through written laws, our third theme. And you can see that Woodruff argued this in ways that I think are kind of familiar to us today. So he said, unless laws are written, people in power can declare the law to be whatever they wish it to be. So by contrast, remember we saw written laws can function to make the law fixed and inflexible, so people in power can't just declare it to be whatever serves their own ends. And Woodruff also argued that we can then have uniformity, right? So that through making statutes a matter of public record, placed where everyone can see them, no one would be, or at least no citizen, an important caveat, would be denied the benefit of law. And notice that he, in the third paragraph there, he uses our familiar modern idiom of written down. We've become so familiar with writing down that even excellent scholars of the ancients tend to forget that the laws were being written up. And Woodruff also draws the implication for uniformity to equality and literacy. So not everyone in Athens was literate, but Athens certainly was a more literate society than other ancient Greek societies, partly because with democratization, written laws came to play a new kind of role. So this is very much a picture of law functioning as we think of it today. Again, here's a later engraving showing Solon writing down. Again, that has such a grip on our modern imaginations. But not his laws were, even in being written up, they weren't there just to be admired as impressive monuments. They were there to be read, recited, and used as texts. And in the Athenian orators, we do find specific reference to the specific texts of the laws, unlike what we find in the ancient Babylonian documents that, as I said, curiously don't cite them. So that brings me then to my third function of democratizing power as the ultimate way to control power. Now, I introduced that with a quotation from a modern scholar, but here's a quotation from an Athenian who puts in the mouth of one of his characters this very aspiration, this ideal that written law is necessary to democracy and has a special connection to democracy. So these are words put by the Athenian playwright Euripides into the mouth of the legendary king of Athens, one Theseus. And it's sort of paradoxical. He puts these words into the mouths of a king, but has him articulate Athenian democratic ideals. And again, you can see the contrast on which these now democratic Athenians were priding themselves. So they say, look, if you imagine a city that's despotic, ruled by a tyrant, then there are no laws common to all. The tyrant gets to decide what the law is, and so there's no equality. There's no uniformity. But when the laws are written down, rich and weak alike have equal justice. So the inflexibility of written law provides uniformity, provides equality, right? The weaker can make use of the very same laws as the stronger. Now again, that ideal, while it flourished in the fully democratic constitution of the late 5th century in Athens, again, it went back to the archaic period. So when we think about Solon, this wasn't yet a democratic constitution, but as an Aristotelian text would say, Solon sets Athens on the path to democracy by already using written law in this way. So here we do see in this 19th century engraving, right, the laws having been written up and Solon pointing to them. And this is a quotation from one of Solon's poems where he says, I wrote laws for the lower and upper classes alike. So this proto-democratic ideal is what finally flowers in Euripides' vision. Again, we see, again, this paradox. The 19th century sees him writing things down. He's sitting at a desk, as LBJ will a century later, but really the laws were being written up on these exones, which were public written boards. So this ideal, this connection between writing, publicity, transparency, equality, democracy, has become very attractive to modern scholars. And many people have almost come to assume really writing has this unique connection to democracy. So I just want to again caution you that that isn't always the case. Remember that I have said writing is a tool. It's also a tool that can be used by kings, tyrants, and oligarchs. This is the fact of written laws, but also bureaucratic record keeping, secret written instructions to ambassadors, and so on. So we shouldn't become so idealistic that we think that writing laws is only and ever democratic. It could be used by all of these other regimes. Nevertheless, the Athenians did come to put their trust in written law as a way of preserving their democracy. So the Athenians really put all their eggs in the basket of written law. And they did this in particular by codifying their laws, writing them all, and making a complete set of laws in 403 BCE. And some of you, if you've listened to some of my past lectures, will know this is a crucial moment in Athens. You may otherwise know. This is just after the end of the Peloponnesian War. Athens has been defeated militarily by Sparta. There's been a failed oligarchic takeover, and democracy has just been restored. And key to that restoration of democracy is this completion of the project of the written codification of the laws. So the Athenians at this moment do really think that written laws are going to be key to protecting democracy. And the way that they made the written laws work, I think, again, is very much the way that we think of written laws working today. So, for example, they made the laws consistent. As one scholar has noted, drawing on Aeschines, one of the orators, it was impossible after 403 for two contradictory laws to be valid at the same time. Similarly, this code rejected retroactive laws. So laws have to treat people uniformly across time. You can't make them retroactive and single people out unfairly. So we see this inflexibility, the fixity of the laws, and their uniformity here as democratic virtues, right? By writing the laws down, fixing them, now rich and poor will be treated fairly. They can all appeal to the same written laws. Laws will be uniform and fixed. And all of this is understood by the Athenians to be virtuous. These are good things about the written laws. But, and here's my final set of thoughts. A virtue can always become an Achilles heel, right? In the sense that something that is a strength can also become a weakness. And this is what Plato would come to think about the fixity and generality of Athenian laws. So this is a kind of thought experiment in one of Plato's dialogues called the Statesman or the Politicus, in which you see the language which kind of echoes with Greek practice, right? What's imagined here is that a city like Athens makes laws, writes them up on blocks of stone, but extends the remit of written laws even to all the arts, to medicine, to navigation. And for example, a doctor would only be allowed to give a patient so much medication as the laws prescribed, even if the patient situation had changed, the laws didn't cover their exact illness, and so on. And what Plato suggests in considering this thought experiment is that here the uniformity and inflexibility of written laws could risk leading to political disaster. Democracies can become too hamstrung by the very fixed code of laws on which the Athenians prided themselves. Now, James Whitley, whom I cited earlier, has pointed out that a similar aspiration is expressed by George Orwell's characters in the parable Animal Farm. So the two pigs who emerge as political leaders on the farm proclaim that they have distilled the new political creed into a new set of 7 commandments that are now to be inscribed on the wall and are going to form an unalterable law by which all the animals on Animal Farm must live forever after. And what happens, of course, is that here the inflexibility and the uniformity end up being sort of hollowed out and turned to bad ends. So if you remember, the sort of ultimate end of this process is that the commandments come to say all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So that's technical uniformity, but actual inequality, right? Uniformity can become a vice as well as a virtue. And so those fears about whether uniformity of law is what we should aim for or whether we need more legal flexibility, I think remain relevant to debates about law today. Nowadays, we debate, can and should laws be tailored to individual circumstances, perhaps with the help of algorithms? Can laws be adequate to all the different situations that modern societies face, or to what extent should executive officials and civil servants be empowered to make regulations, but does that risk undermining the equality and fairness and the original intention of the written laws? And a further vulnerability that I'm going to consider next time is whether written law might foster a kind of permanence, but at the cost of human memory. But for tonight, let's close with another reflection on the ambiguities of law. And this is not on the lines of an architectural blueprint, but in the lines of a poem about love. So these are the closing words of W.H. Auden's poem, Law Like Love. So Auden writes of law, like love, we don't know where or why. Like love, we can't compel or fly. Like love, we often weep. Like love, we seldom keep. Thank you very much for your attention.